So why did local communities side with pirates and not with the government? That's a question that vexes those who combat piracy today just as it did then, which is why it also interests historians. The answer has to do with the fact that all of these, piracy or I guess freebooting, wrecking, smuggling, all of these were ancient trades that were legitimate and respectable because they were seen not only as legal according to custom or even common law, but also because they were seen as beneficial to the community and even to the country, that is, to Britain as a whole. These trades became crimes because the imperial government's financial needs and its new mentality of centralization drove it to try to control and restrict local economic activities and to tax these economic activities. These were attempts by these attempts by the government were seen by locals, high, low, and middle, as novel and therefore as illegal and unconstitutional. And they were seen also as injurious to the local economy and even to the national economy. The point is that resistance to taxation and trade restrictions was not simply a constant and timeless feature of English life. Rather, this level of animus and resistance was a product of a meteoric increase in the scale of taxation following centuries of relative stability. The long 18th century, this was a period of almost 130 years of near constant imperial war between England and France, stretching from 1688, the Glorious Revolution, to 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars. So this period began with significant changes in the nature of taxation and the scope of taxation, as well as the establishment of a permanent national debt in England. During this period, England transformed into what scholars call a fiscal military state, or a tax state. Just to give you a sense of it, consider that overall GNP grew by a factor of 3 over this period, over the long 18th century, but tax revenues increased by a factor of 15. And this is with massive tax evasion. The general consensus at the time that the tax system and the political infrastructure that created and sustained it were unfair or even predatory made many Britons see the state as a conspiracy against them. It was this perception of state and of law that explains the growing willingness of Britons, from aristocrats and ministers to shopkeepers and consumers and dock workers, to help one another evade the tax law. In this framework, the illegal trader was one of us. He was a benefactor of our community, whereas the national government and its taxing arms were increasingly regarded as a corrupt, predatory, and alien force. So, throughout my book, I argue that if we keep in mind this pre-modern understanding of piracy, wrecking, and smuggling, if we keep in mind the general hostility to the imperial government's efforts to outlaw, delegitimize, and suppress these trades, then it will remind us to be more skeptical about the idea that the pirate trials that you've read about in Redeker and Ritchie and Burgess were significant turning points that signaled an effective suppression of piracy. So you might ask, if we shouldn't read too much into these trials, then what should we read into them? What did they signify? So I don't have a good answer for that, except that the Crown and Parliament had been attacking piracy via the law and claiming state jurisdiction at sea for a long time, since at least Henry VIII, if not earlier. Yet we don't read too much into those into this anti-piracy rhetoric and occasional legal actions against pirates in the 16th and 17th centuries. So all I'm recommending is that we continue doing so in the 18th century. Now perhaps what we see here in these trials from the 1690s to the 1720s is a public relations effort on the part of either the Admiralty, the Navy, vis-a-vis Parliament, or on the part of Parliament vis-a-vis the public, or on the part of this or that governor or naval officer to impress a superior. Okay. Another question you might ask and should consider is, okay, well, if Chet claims that these trials did not signify any real change compared to piracy's golden age, and that piracy continued unabated, then why did the big piracy trials end in the 1720s? Isn't that proof that piracy was in fact eradicated in the 1720s? I would answer no, and point to 3 factors to explain the end of these high-publicity pirate trials. First, as I said above, the courts had big pirate captures and prosecutions during the height of the golden age of piracy. And that did not signal a decline in the scope of piracy then. And so there's no need to see these trials in the 1720s as evidence of piracy being effectively suppressed in the 18th century. Second, studies of crime in both the 18th century and the 21st century strongly indicate that the ratio of prosecuted crime to all crime was low and is low. Take a look, for example, at prosecutions for drug abuse and underage drinking in our society compared to drug abuse and underage drinking overall. You know, a lot of drug and alcohol abuse, but few prosecutions. Okay. So changes in prosecution rates tell us more about the behavior and priorities of prosecutors than about the actual lawbreaking in the society. For example, at different times in our own society, we experience spikes in public concerns, in public concern, and therefore spikes in prosecution over child abuse or drug abuse or gun crime, even though it does not correspond with a spike in that brand of crime. And then as public alarm subsides or shifts to something new, prosecutions decline even though the level of criminal activity stays roughly the same. So the fact that the spike in piracy prosecutions came to an end in the late 1720s needn't mean that piracy disappeared in the late 1720s. Just like the fact that the decline in prosecutions against drug possession or industrial pollution or illegal immigration is not evidence of the decline of these crimes. The decline in prosecution could simply mean that the public or the government is no longer interested in such prosecutions. Which brings me to the third factor. I suspect that prosecutors, customs agents, and admiralty judges got the message from the blowback that they received from below in the 1690s, 1710s, and 1720s, that such prosecutions were not helpful to their careers and their social standing in the communities in which they lived. Perhaps that one generation of anti-piracy activism from the 1690s to the 1720s taught them this lesson and made them ease up on this highly unpopular campaign against piracy and other forms of illegal trade. See you in the next video.